Anyway, I want to thank Liz and Peter for their presentations, and we're going to do a rather efficient Q&A discussion here. I have a whole bunch of cards here that I've selected for certain questions, and of course I got my whole iPad filled with questions. But let's take a few minutes to answer some questions, and Tal will give people a microphone. And the first question is really one that overlaps both presentations. And what Peter is kind of advocating is a greater use of electronic health records, which has a lot of challenges in terms of design and adoption and what have you. But let's say in 10 years we have a complete adoption of electronic health records. That leads to a couple of interesting possibilities. Right now, Mini-Sentinel is looking at safety signals, which FDA can possibly use to update a label of a drug. But what you're saying is in the Avastin case, you're looking at the effectiveness of a drug versus its efficacy, which could shed some light on lack of benefit. And do you see that somehow impacting a label in terms of maybe a subset identification where a prior approval might have been in a all-comer population? And then for Liz, the same thing with the electronic health records. One of the applications of electronic health records is to develop clinical decision support tools. So these would be algorithms, sort of like warfarindosing.org, which platelet inhibitor do I use for what patients? This can all come out of this. So the question there is that going to be something the FDA would be interested in regulating in terms of the algorithms that come out of, say, EHR? And from Peter's standpoint, do you see efficacy being having an impact on labeling? And if so, does FDA regulate electronic health records 25 years from now? So maybe I'll turn to Liz first.
Want me to start? Yeah. So
then,
we're actually working on a guidance now about clinical decision support systems that may have a lot of resemblance if you've looked at the mobile apps guidance. We're trying to decide which ones really don't require any or very little regulation and which ones actually have a significant health concern that we'd like to regulate. So there will be guidance coming out at some point on that. But yeah, we are looking into it.
So if you look at it right now, there are two hurdles to bring a drug to market. The first is to get FDA approval for a labeled indication. And then the second is for CMS to decide that they will cover that, new drug, and potentially someday how much they'll pay for that as well. And if you look at the accelerated approval process and the coverage with evidence development policy of CMS, there's no reason why the two couldn't go on in parallel, I think. So if you're at that late stage in the pipeline and you want some final information but provisionally make it accessible, I think it also raises question in CMS, or should raise question in CMS, well, should we pay for that, and do we pay full price or something less, and when do we determine when we're going to do a final approval? So the two, I think, should work together in that process. I think they could using electronic health records. But I think the FDA and CMS need to set some standards. It can't be just any doctor, any patient, anywhere can get this drug the way it is now in accelerated approval. There need to be some strings attached. So you need to be required to collect the data and send it back to the CMS in a way that CMS and FDA trust that data and feel that it's actionable. And that's what the Mini-Sentinel program, I think, begins to lay the groundwork for. You're developing a network of large population bases with electronic records that the FDA will trust the source of that data.
Do you think we're getting set up in any way for misinformation in the sense that electronic health records are generally in larger practices, medical centers, practices with 50 or more physicians, as opposed to private practice, primary care with 1, 2, and 3 physicians, so that the data coming out of electronic health records could be biased by the practice setting, and you wouldn't capture, a high percentage of medical care which is represented by the small office, the 1, 2, 3 physicians, because they're not currently functional enough to get to the kind of information you'd like to get to for things like Avastin and so on.
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think one, that model of small practices is not sustainable. It's not sustainable from a reimbursement point of view, and those practices are drying up pretty quickly. There are about 200 oncology practices that have gone out of business in the last year or two in the United States, gone out of business since that they consolidated to form bigger groups. They joined other medical groups. They're acquired by hospitals. So I think we are driving to a healthcare system that you skate to where the puck is going, not where it is right now. I think the puck is going to large healthcare delivery systems that can deliver on that.
As we heard a lot about technology in this meeting, let's say we have a small company. What is the best time for somebody to start a pre-IDE process? And is it, I know it's early, but what is the sort of triggers that would say I need to come in and talk to CDRH?
Well, we're renegotiating user fees now where pre-IDEs may cost something, so I would say right now, while it's still free. But I think at the point where you realize that you're going to be starting studies specifically to support a regulatory submission would be a great time, because the pre-analytical issues have come up multiple times here. Lots of technical issues that may be specific to your technology and analytical validation. Whether your intended use is even reasonable. I mean, we see a lot of crazy stuff come in, and what kind of clinical information you might need to provide in order to get that device cleared or approved. I think once you decide you're going down the regulatory road and you're going to start studies, you ought to probably consider doing a pre-IDE.
Yeah, is that road negotiable as time goes by after the pre-IDE meeting? Certain minutes are taken.
Yeah,
what do people need to know about the flexibility as they move forward?
Well, we do take minutes, and we do remember what we said. So what we generally like people to do is if something significant changes or something new comes up, that maybe they come back to us and say this has changed, and make sure that they're still on the right track. Or if it's been a long time since you talked to us and maybe clinical standards have changed, or our thoughts scientifically have changed, then you might need to check back in just to make sure that it hasn't changed so much it's going to affect you from a regulatory point of view.
Yeah. Do you ever get a company come in and say, why would I seek FDA approval for a diagnostic when there's no coverage or reimbursement incentives? Is there anything that's going on in terms of CMS, let's say, and FDA, or
I think a lot of
co-reviewing or something?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think, why would I seek FDA approval? And well, I don't know, but what we have set up a pilot program to work with CMS on trying to figure out what kinds of information will be required on both sides. We've done this in the past. What we found is that a lot of companies really want to get on the market before they meet the CMS bar, because a lot of times for diagnostic tests, as you know, and this may be changing, a lot of tests are paid for using procedural codes, and the insurance company doesn't know what they're paying for, so they can get on the market and get reimbursed anyway. I think the AMA is putting out some new codes, or in a year or two or something, that may change that.
Mm-hmm. With the LDTs, you sort of alluded to something in your presentation about regulating LDTs. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about where that might be heading in the future? And maybe let's put it into little buckets. We have screening tests, we have prognostic tests, we have predictive tests. And in the LDT context, is there any difference from the device perspective in terms of how they might be regulated, overseen, and so on? And what is the future of CLIA at that point if FDA gets more involved in regulating LDTs?
Well, CLIA doesn't actually regulate tests. They regulate laboratories. So CLIA is always there. CLIA is there even if you're running an FDA-approved or cleared test. The lab still has to be CLIA compliant, because that's about how the laboratory operates. It's not specifically about the test. So CLIA won't go away, and certainly will still have the same role they have now. In terms of if FDA were to regulate LDTs, it would be like we regulate other tests from a risk basis. So what's the intended use of the test? What's the risk of that? Does it mean you need a PMA? Does it mean you need a 510K? Does it mean you're exempt? That's the thinking, is that's our fundamental law, that we have 3 classes, and that's where devices fit. As to when any policy will be available, as we had a meeting in 2010, we've prepared a draft guidance, and it's under administrative review within the administration, and I don't have any more information than that. So.
Peter, one of the things you suggested was the possibility of alternatives for generating clinical information. For example, an accelerated approval, where there would be a post-marketing, perhaps a large study required to confirm the accelerated approval pathway, maybe based on a surrogate. What would it take for that alternative to become reality? In other words, what would have to be the quality of a electronic health record system to substitute for an actual study that the sponsor would now conduct following an accelerated approval? And I guess the example you cited was the Avastin. People got used to using the drug, the trial was run, the results came in, but now you're saying, well, maybe we don't need those large trials, we can do it faster, we can do it quicker, we can get to the answer much quicker, but what's it going to take for a regulatory agency to rely on electronic health records for that purpose and sort of put aside what they traditionally do?
Well, I think the regulatory agency, FDA or CMS, need to specify what they need, to what types of data do they need to have to make a decision upon. And in the case of an accelerated approval process, where you're looking at clinical benefit in a real-world setting, so CMS would not necessarily want to have the tight restrictions that FDA might want to have on trial eligibility, but may say, no, we're going to loosen this up and we're going to make it open to patients no matter what their renal dysfunction is, what their cardiac status is, because that's the real world. The FDA might say, you know, we can maybe buy that because we're kind of interested in knowing what happens when someone's creatinine is high. You know, the studies don't address that because it said no one can enter the study with a creatinine above 2 or 2.2, whatever. But we would like to have some information about what the proper dose reduction should be in that setting for this drug, and is there any loss of efficacy? So I could see the FDA and CMS seeing some value in this. Mm-hmm. And once they specify what it is that they want to know, then we can begin to work to see how we capture that data in a way that's verifiable, that they can trust the data.
Okay, great. Peter, Liz, thanks for participating, and we are at the end of the session. I see a big 0 though, that means time's up. So thanks for hanging in here, everybody.